You've been told gladiators were heroic warriors who could win their freedom through valor. But the Roman legal code classified them as infamia, a category of non-persons who existed as state inventory alongside livestock and mining equipment. And the evidence carved into their bones tells a story of systematic brutalization that makes modern factory farming look humane. Right now, in storage facilities beneath the Colosseum and in museum archives across Italy, there are skeletal remains of gladiators showing injuries so repetitive, so deliberately inflicted, that forensic pathologists compare them to torture victims, not athletes. The myth of the noble gladiator, the warrior who could fight his way to freedom and glory, is one of history's most successful propaganda campaigns, and it worked so well that 21 centuries later we're still repeating Roman marketing slogans as historical fact. Let me show you what actually happened when human beings were legally reclassified as equipment, and why every gladiator story you've ever heard was written by the people who profited from their deaths. Here's what the legal texts actually say. The Digest of Justinian, compiling centuries of Roman law, places gladiators in a specific juridical category. Capite diminuti, persons who have suffered capital diminishment. They weren't citizens, they weren't even fully human under law. They were property. The exact same legal language used to describe a plow or a warehouse applied to gladiators. They could be bought, sold, rented, and destroyed at their owner's discretion. When a gladiator died, it wasn't murder, it was property damage. The owner might sue for compensation, but the penalty was financial, not criminal. You could kill a gladiator with the same legal consequences as breaking someone's cart. Let that sink in. The Roman Empire, with its sophisticated legal philosophy and elaborate rhetoric about virtue and honor, created an entire category of human beings who existed outside the protections of law, and then built an entertainment industry around watching them die. Now listen carefully to what the contracts say. We have preserved gladiator contracts, auctoramenta, and they're explicit about what the gladiator agrees to: Iuri vincere verberari feroc necari, to be burned, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword. You signed a contract agreeing to your own torture and execution. And here's what makes it even more legally perverse. The contract was considered binding precisely because the gladiator had legally ceased to be a person with rights. A citizen couldn't sign away their right to life, that would be legally void. But a gladiator could because they'd already forfeited personhood by entering the arena. The contract didn't create their non-person status, it confirmed it. This wasn't primitive barbarism. This was sophisticated legal theory applied to systematic dehumanization. The skeletal evidence destroys every romantic myth. Archaeologists have excavated gladiator cemeteries, most famously at Ephesus and York, and the bones tell stories that ancient propaganda never mentioned. Multiple healed fractures to the same locations. Left forearm, right shin, skull. These aren't combat injuries. These are training injuries inflicted repeatedly in the same vulnerable spots until the bone thickens from constant trauma. Forensic analysis shows these men were being deliberately injured in sublethal ways to create scar tissue and bone density that would allow them to sustain more damage in actual combat. They weren't being trained to win. They were being conditioned to absorb punishment without dying too quickly. One skeleton from Ephesus shows 11 separate skull fractures, all healed. This man was hit in the head with blunt weapons repeatedly over years and survived each time because the blows were calibrated, not for his survival, but for maximum entertainment value with minimum property loss. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Analysis of the vertebrae shows compression patterns consistent with carrying heavy loads while malnourished. Gladiators weren't fed like athletes. They were fed like livestock being fattened. High-calorie diets of barley and beans designed to build subcutaneous fat that would bleed dramatically when cut, but wouldn't immediately incapacitate. Roman physicians wrote treatises on gladiator nutrition, and they're explicit. The goal was creating bodies that would produce maximum visual spectacle when wounded. A lean, muscular fighter bleeds less, dies faster, provides less entertainment. A gladiator with a layer of fat would bleed profusely from shallow cuts, creating the appearance of catastrophic injury while remaining capable of continuing the fight. They were being engineered for suffering. Deliberately, scientifically, read the medical texts carefully. Galen, the most famous physician in Roman history, began his career as a gladiator surgeon. His writings describe the injuries he treated, and more importantly, which injuries he was instructed not to treat. Lannistas, the gladiator trainers who owned these men, would prohibit treatment for certain wounds because allowing them to heal improperly would create more dramatic scarring or permanent disfigurement that increased the gladiator's entertainment value. Galen describes being ordered to set broken bones at incorrect angles deliberately to create visible deformity. He describes infections being allowed to fester to create suppurating wounds that would horrify crowds. This wasn't medical incompetence. This was medical collaboration in systematic torture, documented by the physician himself without apparent moral conflict, because legally and socially he wasn't treating patients. He was maintaining equipment. This is the part historians rarely mention. The vast majority of gladiators never fought in the Colosseum, they never achieved fame, they never came close to freedom. They died in provincial amphitheaters during minor festivals, their names unrecorded, their deaths unnoticed except as line items in an editor's expense report. We have accounting documents from games in North African cities showing the cost calculation. Renting a gladiator for a day cost approximately what you'd pay for a decent horse. Buying one outright cost about the same as a small house. And if he died, the editor who hired him paid a death fee to the Lanista, usually about half the purchase price. These weren't warriors, they were rental equipment with death insurance. The evidence becomes even more disturbing when you examine who actually became gladiators. The Romantic myth says they were prisoners of war, condemned criminals, or volunteers seeking glory. The reality is more complex and more exploitative. Yes, war captives became gladiators, but not the warriors. Roman military doctrine was to execute enemy combatants or enslave them for agricultural labor. The captives sent to gladiator schools were usually civilians from conquered territories, people with no military training, forced to learn combat for entertainment. The condemned criminals sent to the arena, damnati ad gladium, weren't given weapons and a chance to win freedom. That was a different category, damnati ad ludum, and it was vanishingly rare. Most condemned criminals were simply executed in the arena as entertainment between gladiator matches, torn apart by animals or forced to fight unarmed until they died. And the volunteers. Here's where Roman economics created a perfect exploitation trap. Free men could volunteer for gladiator school by signing an auctoramentum, the contract agreeing to be burned, beaten, and killed. Why would anyone do this? Because Rome had no bankruptcy protection, no social safety net, and debt slavery was common. A man drowning in debt, facing the loss of his family and his freedom, could sign a gladiator contract and receive an immediate cash payment, a signing bonus. That money could free his family from debt, and if he died in the arena, well, he'd already lost his legal personhood when he signed the contract, but his family kept the money. The volunteer gladiator wasn't seeking glory. He was selling his body and his life to protect his family from destitution, and Roman law made this transaction routine, even celebrated it as masculine virtue. Now understand the machinery of the games themselves. Gladiatorial combat wasn't spontaneous or fair. It was choreographed, staged, and controlled to maximize entertainment and minimize waste. We have discovered training manuals. One particularly detailed example was found in Vindolanda, showing that gladiators practiced specific move sequences, like actors rehearsing fight choreography. They weren't fighting to kill, they were fighting to perform. The actual deaths came at specific moments determined by the editor, signaled by the crowd, but controlled by economic calculation. A dead gladiator cost money. Too many deaths would bankrupt the sponsor. So most matches were designed to produce dramatic injury, submission, and theatrical appeals for mercy, which the crowd or editor could grant or deny based on entertainment value, not combat performance. The thumbs-up, thumbs-down myth, completely invented by 19th century artists. The Roman gesture was pollis verso, turned thumb, but we don't actually know which direction meant death. What we do know from contemporary accounts is that the decision had nothing to do with the gladiator's courage or skill. It was audience management. If the crowd was bored, kill the loser to end the match. If they were entertained, spare him to fight again. The gladiator's agency, his courage, his skill, his will to survive was irrelevant. He was a prop in someone else's show. Here's the evidence that destroys the freedom myth entirely. We have exactly 4 documented cases of gladiators being awarded the rudes, the wooden sword symbolizing freedom, across 3 centuries of Roman games. 4. Out of hundreds of thousands of gladiators. The historian Martial mentions it as an exceptional honor, so rare it was newsworthy. And even those 4 cases, freedom meant they were no longer required to fight, but they remained infamia, legally marked. They couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, couldn't testify in court. They were free from the arena, but never free from the stigma of having been property. The promise of freedom was marketing. The reality was that once you entered a gladiator school, your dehumanization was permanent, regardless of whether you survived. But here's what makes this story so important for understanding how systematic dehumanization functions. Rome didn't hide what it was doing. The legal classification of gladiators as non-persons was public knowledge. The contracts explicitly stating they agreed to torture and death were standard documents. The medical texts describing how to engineer their bodies for suffering were published works. Roman society knew exactly what gladiatorial games were. They simply didn't consider it immoral because the victims had been legally reclassified as things, not people. Once that classification was established, any brutality became acceptable. The law said they weren't fully human. Therefore, watching them suffer wasn't cruelty. It was entertainment. Read the graffiti from Pompeii carefully. Celadus the Thracian makes all the girls swoon. Crescens the net fighter, master of evening. These aren't celebrations of human beings. These are the ancient equivalent of sports merchandise slogans, branding for property that happened to be shaped like men. The gladiators became celebrities not because Romans recognized their humanity, but because they were valuable property whose fame increased their rental price and death fee compensation. A famous gladiator wasn't more free. He was more expensive. The long-term consequences shaped Western civilization. When Rome fell and Christian emperors officially banned gladiatorial games in 404 CE, the legal frameworks of infamia didn't disappear. They mutated. Medieval serf law, colonial slavery codes, modern prison labor systems, all of them contain echoes of the Roman innovation of creating categories of humans who exist outside legal protection. The language changed. The specific mechanisms evolved. But the core principle remained. If you can legally classify certain people as non-persons, you can do anything to them and it's not a crime. It's administration. The skeletal evidence from gladiator cemeteries shows something else, something the propaganda never mentioned. Many of these men lived into their 30s and 40s, which seems to contradict the idea that gladiator life was uniformly fatal. But here's the grim reality those bones reveal. They survived not because they were freed, but because they became trainers. The worst fate wasn't dying in the arena. It was surviving long enough to be put in charge of training the next generation of property, inflicting on others what had been inflicted on you, becoming part of the machinery that had consumed your own humanity. Some of those skeletons show evidence of injuries from being struck by multiple weapons. The marks of someone who spent years teaching combat techniques by allowing students to practice on their body. They survived the arena only to become permanent practice equipment. This changes everything we think we know about Roman civilization. We celebrate Roman law, Roman engineering, Roman literature, and all of it was built on a foundation that explicitly required creating categories of humans who could be legally tortured to death for entertainment. The Colosseum wasn't an aberration of Roman culture. It was the logical expression of it. A society sophisticated enough to develop complex legal philosophy and advanced engineering was also sophisticated enough to systematize brutality at industrial scale, and to create cultural narratives that made that brutality seem not just acceptable but admirable. The definitive truth is this: there were no heroic gladiators. There were only enslaved people, condemned criminals, and desperate volunteers who were legally transformed into state inventory, systematically brutalized, and forced to perform their own destruction for public entertainment. The stories of freedom and glory were advertising, propaganda created by the same institutions that profited from their deaths. And those stories worked so perfectly that 2,000 years later, we still make movies celebrating the nobility of men who were being tortured according to medical protocols designed to maximize their suffering. The gladiators weren't warriors. They were victims of one of history's most sophisticated systems of legal dehumanization, and every heroic story told about them is an insult to what was actually done to their bodies and their lives. If you've learned anything from this investigation into Rome's systematic dehumanization machinery, hit that subscribe button on Mythbusting, because we're going to keep uncovering the uncomfortable truths that our cultural narratives prefer to romanticize. The distinction between civilization and barbarism isn't technology or law. It's whether those systems recognize the humanity of everyone or create categories of non-persons who can be legally destroyed. Rome chose the latter, codified it, celebrated it, and we inherited the stories without asking who benefited from telling them. So what other historical heroism myth should we dismantle next? Drop your suggestions in the comments below.